As we take our seats, I remind everybody they can log on to slido.com and to submit and vote for questions. Minister, we have known each other for a long time. I've been in this role 5 years, and in your previous portfolio, you were one of the first to reach out and to really connect with us and find out what was happening on the ground in Greater Vancouver during COVID. And so I've had the opportunity to watch you evolve in this role of yours now. And, quite just on a personal note, I don't think that you would have envisioned that it would have been quite all of this when you were appointed Foreign Affairs Minister. Maybe we'll just start with a few personal reflections on that, and you can give some remarks about where things stand in this precise moment, on this precise day, in regards to tariffs, because it has been just such an ever-changing situation.
Yeah, well, I'm happy to see you again, Bridgitte. You and I worked a lot on creating the first economic development agency, a regional development agency for the Pacific, which is called Pacifican. You needed a Québécoise to make that happen. That's pretty funny. So I was just telling Bridgitte beforehand when Prime Minister Trudeau appointed me Foreign Minister back in 2021, I was calling different former foreign ministers, and one of which, well known, is called Jean Chrétien. And I called Jean, and I'm like, okay, so what are your comments? What are your advice? What do you think? He said, Mélanie, it's great, it's very prestigious, but you'll never be in the media. Nothing will happen. So I was like, okay, well, thank you. And then 4 months later, the war in Ukraine started. And then from there, of course, we know the war, the October 7th, the war in Gaza. It's, the entire Middle East, Lebanon, tensions with China. We had our own issues also with India. It just never stopped every day. And now we know it is the question of what is the U.S. role in the world? The bilateral relationship between us and them, but also fundamentally the geopolitical tectonic plates are moving so fast. Are moving so fast that there's a fear of the changes creating a vacuum, which could lead to us to be in a very dangerous world. And we are indeed living in a much more dangerous world than 4 years ago. So, but we can organize ourselves. We can make sure that we defend our interests. It's not as if the arc of history is just something that we cannot have an impact on and we can't bend. But to do so, we need to be organized. And so let's talk about the tariffs.
Okay, so yesterday, well, let me back it up. We thought March 4th was going to be the deadline, and then we thought it was April 2nd, and then we were told yesterday it is March 4th. So I have not seen Twitter in the last hour or so I don't know if it has changed. So let's assume that that tariffs could be imposed on March 4th. Let's talk about the Team Canada approach and the efforts that your government has undertaken to try to alleviate the imposition of these tariffs.
Yeah, so there are 3 executive orders that we have to bear in mind. That's why the date seems a bit conflicting. But for President Trump to talk about a date, he actually is linking it to an executive order he has signed. So the first one we're referring to is the one linked to the fact that there is a crisis at the border, as quote unquote, and that, we need to address the fentanyl issue. So we came up with a very strong border plan, $1.3 billion that we invested in. We have a new border czar. And that's why this executive order, which was scheduled to be in January, was paused for 30 days. And that's the March 4th date. And so when you hear in the media that we're talking a lot about border security, it is linked to that executive order. And that is a threat of 25% tariffs against Canadian products and 10% for oil and gas. So that's the first executive order. And to be frank, we came up with the border plan because we believe we needed to do it for us, because we know the U.S. is a net exporter also of illegal drugs and also of irregular migrants. So we needed to make sure that Canadians were safe at home. Second executive order is linked to steel and aluminum. and that's 25% tariffs on steel and aluminum. This is an executive order that actually President Trump signed back in the days and during his first mandate. And it was an executive order that President Biden also signed, but we had an exemption and the European Union had an exemption. So the date for that is March 12th. And then there's a third one and last one, which is affecting all countries in the world having a trade relationship with the U.S. On Inauguration Day, on January 20th, President Trump signed an executive order asking all federal agencies to report to the Commerce Secretary to study all the different reciprocal trade relationships with the U.S. So when you hear reciprocal tariffs, it's linked to that executive order. And what the White House wants to do is to be able to do a deal with every single trading partners. And when they negotiate with us, they don't only talk about trade, guys. They actually talk about a flurry of different aspects of different topics. And so it is the case for us, but it is the case also for many other countries in the world.
So over the last many weeks, I would say almost all of the cabinet, the federal cabinet, has been in Washington, D.C. Yourself has been there, the Prime Minister. So how successful do you think those discussions are? And I hesitate to call them negotiations because it's unclear what the end game is. But what's your sense on how much progress you're seeing?
Yeah, so I've been 5 times to the U.S., Washington and Mar-a-Lago, and I've had many, many different conversations with the Trump administration itself. So Howard Lutnick, who's the Commerce Secretary, who's also talking to Minister LeBlanc, who is a key part of the discussions, negotiations. And so I'm in touch with the White House, but I'm also in touch with the Senate. And in the Senate, I'm talking to Lindsey Graham nearly every day. So I just spoke to him this morning about the different subjects, including, of course, the tariffs. He's very close to President Trump. He's a Trump whisperer, as we call it. That's it. And I've met, John Thune, the leader of the Senate majority, who's the number 2 of the Republicans on Capitol Hill, and, go on and on and on. And I'm talking also to Democrats. That's really, really important. So it is important because I think we've done a really good job, guys, across the country to say to the American people and to their leaders that tariffs are a really bad idea. And the only people on earth that will be able to push back against President Trump regarding tariffs are Americans themselves. And so the good news is when you see all ministers going to Washington, when you see, colleagues from even, MPs going to Washington, premiers going to Washington, it's great. But fundamentally, when we buy local, when we decide to support Canadian products, when we decide to actually travel across Canada or around the world and not necessarily travel to the U.S., we're sending a message. And that's the real Team Canada. Because now when you see polling in the U.S., the latest is there's a majority of Americans that don't support tariffs against Canada and Mexico.
We know that tariffs are going to hurt people on both sides of the border.
Yeah.
Some analysis that has been done is that it would cost each American about $1,300 more for Canadians, about $1,800 or $1,900 each. And that message, I've had conversations with business leaders in Washington State and in Oregon and some other of the Western states, and certainly they understand the gravity of the situation. In Canada, it's been the top of the media cycle for weeks now.
Yeah.
My concern is that it's not getting the same level of profile or importance in the United States. So how can we as Canadians help drive that message that tariffs will be painful for both Canadians and Americans?
Well, I think we did, particularly when Prime Minister Trudeau, Minister LeBlanc, myself, and Minister McGuinty went and said, you know what, $155 billion worth of tariffs. When the executive order was signed, the first one, regarding 25% tariffs against us on fentanyl, and we decided to say, very strong response, $155 billion worth of tariffs, and the first tranche is $30 billion. We were the first, internationally to say, here we go, this will be our response. We're the biggest client of the U.S. by far. We buy more than China, than Japan, than the UK and France all together. And so when we're the first trading partner of the U.S. And so when Prime Minister Trudeau gave his speech, which I think was a really good one, to the American people themselves, it made national news in the U.S. And what we saw is President Trump lost the narrative over that weekend. We need to continue to be strong. We need to continue to say, no problem, we'll find a way to address the border issues, but if you do so, we'll fight back. And this will have an impact on American people who will pay more at the pump, who will pay more at the grocery store, and jobs will be lost in the U.S., period. And so, did you vote for that, American people? No, you didn't. There was a clear promise from President Trump, which was, we will make sure to put down inflation. This is going against his most important electoral promise. And so we need to convey that message. You're doing a great job, along with all business people getting involved. And we have many allies in the U.S. We're the country also, on earth that knows more the American people. We get how they think. We have friends and families on the other side of the border. We're connected throughout, through mayors, through governors, through representatives. When I talk to my European colleagues, they don't. They just don't. They're just in another world. They're in Europe. They haven't all had their aha moment yet with
that might be coming. We'll
with
talk
US.
about that in a minute. But beyond fentanyl and the border issue, the other topic or issue that appears to be a challenge or a problem for President Trump is around our defense spending. And you recently said that you thought Canada should increase its defense spending. So does that mean that you think we'll reach that 2% target, and how would we do that?
I think, when it comes to defense, it's not about the relationship with the U.S. only. It is fundamentally about us. I've been the foreign minister for more than 3 years and a half at this point, and we need to defend ourselves. I just told you that the world is much more a dangerous place. When I was here, I think 2 years ago, and we launched the Indo-Pacific strategy, I told that there was an issue in terms of competition between China and the U.S., which could lead potentially to, a greater international tensions and potentially an international conflict.
I do remember that conversation.
So now we presented a new defense policy update. I presented a new Arctic strategy last December, because there is now cooperation between Russia and China in the Arctic, which is affecting our own sovereignty, which we need to do more. But my point is I'm hawkish on this. We need to get to the 2% quicker. And 2 days ago, the UK just announced that they would get to 2.5%. This is of the world in which we are now.
So what would be a reasonable timeline for us to get to that 2%?
Well, I won't go into the timelines, but my point is we need to be smart about it, and we need to create jobs at home. When we talk about defense spending or investments, all of you business community members should think, okay, how can I be part of that supply chain? How can I, be part of the investments the government will be making? Because we can't just invest in defense and send basically all our money, or taxpayers' money, to the U.S.
You're talking about the full supply chain when
Absolutely.
It comes to defense.
Well, yes, because it is about, indeed, investing in the Arctic and making sure we have bases there and much more equipment, much more people as well. But it is about, the entire spectrum of technology that is linked to the protection of Canada, physically, but also virtually, digitally.
It is becoming very clear that this is not just an issue around trade relationships. It is an issue of sovereignty. Mm-hmm. And you just said a few minutes ago, it is a dangerous time. It is becoming a more dangerous time. I think yesterday the comments from the Prime Minister of the UK were quite surprising mm-hmm. for many Canadians, and it made us feel even more alone in this. What was your take?
Well, I think that when it comes to Canada and UK, no country will be ever able to divide us. You know, I'm in British Columbia right now. You know, it's part of our history. It's part of our relationship. We have the same head of state. But having spent the last 2 weeks and a half in Europe and also going to Johannesburg in South Africa for the G20, we are the ones, along I think with Denmark and Panama, that are really, really, and Mexico obviously, really facing this much more tense relationship, which we were all surprised by. Because that was not discussed during the electoral period in the U.S. And I think that I was at the Munich Security Conference when J.D. Vance gave his speech. I think that the many diplomats in the room were heard a rhetoric they never heard from the U.S., which really shocked them. And afterwards, there were conversations about the relationship the U.S. had with Ukraine and with Russia, and that was also a moment of very great concern in Europe. But when I was talking to them and with the foreign ministers of France, of Germany, of the EU, and also of the UK, what we were going through, and saying, hey, we're the canary in the coal mine, guys. This is coming to you. You're next. They were believing me and taking lots of notes. But this week, Trump said, the EU was created to, against the US, and 25% tariffs against the EU. And,
it's a wake-up call.
Well, I wrote to all of them. I said, I told you. And they were like, yeah, thanks, Mel. So we'll listen to you more. So no, but also why it was important is, meanwhile, I was there to organize the counter tariffs, because my point was, we've already published a $30 billion list of first tariffs. We're the only ones that have published it. They are affected already by the steel and aluminum tariffs. So we're taking our list, talking to the Europeans to make sure we all have the same list.
Do you think our relationship with the UK has changed, though, given the new-ish Prime Minister, Keir Starmer?
No, I think, I was just in London, had a really good conversation with his chief of staff. I went to the 10 Downing Street. I was there on Tuesday. Or Friday, yeah. I was with Jonathan Powell, his national security advisor. I sat down also with the foreign minister, David Lammy. I think that just countries are figuring out, what does that mean, a change of leadership from the US and the world? And so I think, all of us, all countries are looking at ourselves, and we're anxious. We need to make sure that we organize ourselves. And by organizing ourselves, we are able to bend that arc of history I was talking to you about. So that's why counter tariffs, having the same products, targeting the same regions in the US is really, really important.
Bend the arc of history. I have not seen the video, but I understand that within the last hour or two, there was a display between Vladimir Zelensky and President Trump in the White House, which actually became an argument, which is quite hard to believe with media in the room. Have you heard about this or seen this? And then what would your reaction be to the situation with Ukraine, given you have had a lot of dealings with Ukraine?
Well, I haven't seen the video yet. Of course, my phone was just buzzing and buzzing and buzzing. And I spoke to Lindsey Graham actually 15 minutes before he went into that press conference, and he was actually quite positive, and they were going to sign the critical minerals deal. And I had spoken to the chief of staff of Zelensky, Andriy Yermak, 3 days ago, to try to organize what they would say and how, and he was briefing me on their strategy. what President Zelensky right now is going through in Ukraine is similar to what we're seeing here. There's really a rallying up around the flag, and he's actually extremely popular, more than maybe a month ago, because Ukrainians are really, really mad at the way that, you know, the comments about his leadership have been you know, expressed. And so I think that, and we've seen Ukrainians, you can never think, you can never underestimate them. And President Zelensky is somebody that has gone through a long war of 3 years, having death threats against him. You know, he has shown great leadership and courage. So I think that, you know, he will never settle for a bad deal. And I think it is for us important to make sure that we work with him and with our allies on that, because if we don't get to a good deal for Ukraine, we're sending a message to Russia, and we know that President Putin has no red lines. And if he has no red lines, it means that then NATO territory is at threat, and if NATO territory is at threat, we are at threat. So that's why when you try to connect, why is Ukraine important and why we need to make sure to support Ukrainians and European security, it is because basically we have played a role in Europe to defend Europe, but when we defend Europe, we also defend our own space, our own sovereignty, because we know that solidarity goes both ways.
And not knowing the details of what this display was in the White House this morning, you know, what does it say about the shifting allegiances between the U.S. and Russia?
Well, I think there's still a lot to be seen there. I think that it is important that there be conversations diplomatically. At one point, we know the war needs to end. The question is, how will it end, on what conditions, and how we can make sure that, you know, we get a good deal that will make sure that President Putin doesn't leave, rearm, and re-attack. That's the risk. We cannot be in a position where, a bit like what was done on Crimea and Minsk, you know, the peace accords of Minsk I and then Minsk II, which eventually led to the full-fledged invasion of Ukraine. Ukrainians have a right to be part of Europe, have a right to also for their own destiny, and if we don't do that, it means that, you know, the borders of every single country on the planet are actually can be redrawn through force, and we're a middle power. We are not a superpower. We believe in these international norms and rules that have kept us safe, that are at the core of the United Nations, that are at the core of the, you know, the idea of peace that our grandparents had in mind after the Second World War, and so we need to defend them. And meanwhile, I think what I've been saying a lot to the Trump administration is President Trump cannot have a bad deal on Ukraine, because China is looking on the other side of the ocean to see what type of deal, because then it's also the relationship of what China could do on Taiwan. And he does not want to be seen weak even at home. So there are many different reasons why this Ukrainian deal is really, really important, because it sets for the next steps of whether we will be in a much more peaceful world without too many threats to our security or not.
So how does Canada's role on the world stage evolve given these kinds of global tensions? Canada was always known as a peacekeeping country and had a pretty central role. Things are obviously very fluid and changing very quickly. So where do you see Canada's role in the global stage? And I think that's also one of the questions on Slido there.
Well, I think, you know, when I came 2 years ago also talking about the Indo-Pacific strategy, we need to reckon that we need new alliances and new partnerships. We have to be closer to Japan and Korea than we are from Germany, France, and the UK. We need to be closer also to Europe. We need to diversify, not only the trade side, but also on the security front. We need to make sure that we have, you know, I presented a new approach on the Arctic. We have to be closer to the 7 of the 8 Arctic states, which are now Finland, Sweden, which are part of NATO now, which were not, 3 years ago, but also Norway, Denmark, Iceland, so the Nordics. And I'm seeing that in full display, Bridgitte, because I'm seeing that now we're having conversations with countries that we weren't that close to. But now we're saying, okay, we need to share intelligence. We need to do more defense cooperation. We need more of your trade, and we need also more of your knowledge. That is what's happening. And we have so much to offer. We have fantastic natural resources. We have, I was saying to the French, you want uranium? Why do you get them from Kazakhstan? You can get it from us. Potash, fertilizers. There's still no sanctions on Belarusian and Russian fertilizers and potash because it's too expensive for European farmers. Get it from us, and you'll put maximum pressure on Belarus, and Russia. So, and we have, all the talents. Basically, we're a very rich country, have lots to offer, but we have not necessarily had the reflex to diversify, and we've been over-reliant on the U.S.
Do you think that there is enough profile and importance being put on the Arctic? I feel like there's a lot of conversations and a lot of analysis about a lot of other pieces of this puzzle. Yeah. But the Arctic, to me, seems it is one incredibly important piece of the puzzle that maybe we're underestimating.
Well, when I talk about the Arctic, a couple of things. First, I don't think it will be the theater of where tensions will start. But I think it will be a theater where it will be impacted by all the other tensions. So President Putin went to Beijing last spring, and he signed a military cooperation agreement with President Xi to have military cooperation between China and Russia in the Arctic. Before the war in Ukraine, Russians believed, like we all did, in Arctic states, the 8 Arctic states, that the Arctic needed to be a high north, low tension region. And there was a lot of multilateralism, lots of diplomatic conversations, and it was kept there through the Arctic Council. But bit by bit, as the war in Ukraine was not successful for the Russians, and as they were drawn into sending more resources and eventually asking for North Korean troops, they allowed more China to come in the Arctic because China for a long time has been wanting to be in the Arctic. The Arctic, as the ice is melting, will be the shortest route between Asia and Europe. And that is why, and it's going through our Northwest Passage. So that's why we need to make sure that we are there defending our sovereignty, but also working with other Arctic nations, with NATO, with the Americans on NORAD to ultimately defend ourselves.
British Columbia is uniquely positioned when it comes to being the Asia-Pacific gateway. You're part of the Indo-Pacific strategy. And while Canada is looking to diversify trade relationships, the question here is really how much of the loss of trade with the U.S. could we expect to make up with relationships with those in the Asia-Pacific or the Indo-Pacific region?
Well, a lot of the loss of trade with the U.S., first and foremost, could be outsided by the fact that there's no internal barriers between provinces in Canada. And I've seen even numbers of the 25% tariffs, 20% of
I believe there's a meeting today. The Committee on Internal Trade is meeting today.
And so, we built our country based on the fact that we were preoccupied about the U.S. and preoccupied about the fact that we would, be under their threat during the 19th century. And we created all this infrastructure, east-west, obviously with the train, but eventually more infrastructure. But we've driven a lot of our trade north-south. And now we need to reconnect again, even more. And
it will take time.
It will take time, but I like Carney's strategy of saying, we'll meet with the premiers, and rather than saying, you know what do you want to protect in terms of your own internal trade barriers, but saying, okay, what is the first thing that you want to keep? And let's start from there. Because
30 years I have been following internal trade. 30
I know,
years.
but we're in a new moment now.
True.
And we have to reckon it, and we have to seize the opportunity, because it's hundreds of thousands of jobs in Canada that are at stake.
So first those internal trade barriers.
And then, of course, well, you know, we know that the highest growth that is coming from Asia. And of course, if we're able to have more trade with Japan, with Korea, but also with Indonesia, with the Philippines, lots of these countries, it will have a huge impact. We just signed a new free trade agreement with Indonesia. We're working on one with the Philippines. We're part of the CPTPP. And, you know, we are, in terms of not only trade, but even security, we're working even more with Japan and Korea. What I would like us to be able to do also is, that's not linked to trade, it's more linked to security and defense. But when you look at our country and you look at the east of our country, we have NATO protecting us. And it's a relationship between Europe and us. And then when you look at much more the Arctic, we have NORAD, which is a partnership with the U.S. And at the same time, we're allowing even more NATO being part of that part of our country in terms of military exercises and cooperation. We have no security architecture for the West. There's a partnership between the U.S., Japan, and Korea, which was signed by President Biden, which is called the Camp David Accords. There's AUKUS also, that is a nuclear submarine deal, but the first nuclear submarines are scheduled for 2032. So it's, you know, there's lots of work to be done. I've been pitching to have a North Pacific for Quad, which we would be working with the U.S., with Japan, with the South Korea. And that could be a way also to bring positively the U.S. on board, but also working with these two countries to ultimately defend the North Pacific. And if we're able to do that, then we're able to even be stronger with the South Koreans and the Japanese.
British Columbia could play a key role in that.
Absolutely. Not only in terms of C-SPAN being here, but more than that, I think, you know, British Columbia now is offering through Kitimat the way for Japanese and South Koreans to
LNG Canada.
Yeah, get rid of their over-reliance on Russian gas. And we need to also make sure that we can offer a lot of the food they need, because we're a agricultural superpower, as we know, and the cost of groceries have increased all around the world, and more they're able to have access to a lot of our wheat, a lot of our cereals and everything else. Well, that's extremely positive as well.
With all due respect, governments, all governments, are not known to move quickly. Given the economic crisis and I would say the security crisis that we're finding ourselves in, is there a sense of urgency that perhaps you haven't seen before?
Well, I saw governments going fast during COVID, and you and I worked on that, and we were on it every time, and we took big decisions quickly. Was it perfect? No. Crisis management is never perfect. You used to be in charge of a public relations firm, you know that. I think now we are in an emergency. We are in a security crisis. And definitely we need to do more in terms of internal trade. And I know my colleague Anita Nanan is on this. And I think that, you know, if we can, within the next year, make sure that we address the internal trade barriers, it would be very consequential for our country. And meanwhile, you know, I'm just seeing, in the past week in Europe, there's been a meeting with Macron, President Macron in France, with all the Europeans on how to develop security guarantees for Ukraine. Starmer just called another meeting on Sunday about that. And so things are going fast, Bridgitte, like by the hour. And so, as politicians, we have to do two things. We need to be able to deal with the crisis management, which is taking a lot of our time. I'm working 98% on the U.S. right now. And when I'm talking to Europeans, I'm actually working on the U.S. file. But also, it is to be able to work on the longer-term issues that we need to be able to address. Not letting go the Indo-Pacific strategy, for example. Not letting go the Arctic strategy. Just taking the decisions. That way, the public service, like our military, everybody has the work to do and to be able to implement.
How much weight do you give the rumor and then the disclaimer of that rumor around Canada being kicked out of the Five Eyes network? Is this something that we need to be concerned about?
Well, I took good note of Peter Navarro's comments about that. And we will always defend our security and our security alliances.
But what would it mean if that alliance broke down?
Well, I think that we need to be closer to our European colleagues, and particularly the UK. That was also one of the reasons why I was in the UK, to be able to meet with the National Security Advisor of Keir Starmer, Jonathan Powell. And, when I'm talking of having new partnerships and new allies, it is all about that. It's keeping the ones we have, but also thinking differently and looking at what can be done. You have to do both.
Canada has a unique opportunity ahead in June, hosting the G7 summit. I have part of an executive group that is dealing with the B7, which is a group, a business group that's helping to inform some of the topics that will be discussed at the G7. And no surprise, it's all economic security and resilience.
Yep.
How do you expect those conversations to go? Maybe it's a bit hard of a question to answer because it's several months out and things change so quickly, but what is Canada's role at the G7 given its hosting, and what do you expect those discussions to be like?
So we'll continue to be dealing with unpredictability. That's just a fact. And yes, we'll be looking at Twitter a lot. That's just a fact. I had the first meeting with foreign ministers of the G7, including Marco Rubio, the new Secretary of State, when I was in Munich, and we were able to get to a good press release. I was happy because it clearly mentioned, for example, that security guarantees for Ukraine were essential. And after that, the Prime Minister was able to chair a meeting on February 24th, which was the third year commemoration of the war in Ukraine, and President Trump participated. Now, the first meeting in person in Canada is going to happen in Quebec, in Charlevoix, between March 12th and March 14th. And all foreign ministers have somebody working with them that is called a political director. And we call them the PDs. And the political directors are right now in Vancouver, of all the 7 countries, plus the European Union. And I met with them this morning. Because I think fundamentally our objective is G7 unity. We have to keep the G7 together. And so that will be my main focus. And of course, we will look at how we can work on different issues from, what's going on in the Middle East, how do we address issues linked to China, the crisis in Haiti, Venezuela, but also, of course, European security in Ukraine.
I don't think we can avoid talking about the Trump administration without asking you a question about Elon Musk. He plays a large role. Speaking of Trump whispers, he is probably a key one. So how does Canada deal with that kind of factor in an administration when this person is unelected, but given so much of a mandate and so much influence to take action?
Well, I think that's a question to be asked to also American lawmakers. Because all secretaries of the Trump administration, or of any administration of the executive branch, go before Congress and are being confirmed and are being asked questions, tough questions, and then there's a vote. And so it's the question of how much does the legislative branch is keeping a check on the executive branch, and how the courts also are playing a role of counterbalance. That's a strong democracy. And we have to see how things will evolve in the U.S. Meanwhile, for us, we need to make sure that we defend our own sovereignty, including the fact of having strong media here at home, and also a very strong CBC Radio-Canada, which is essential to make sure we have a strong democracy. We cannot take, because the media is another counterpower. You know, there are three, basically. It's the courts, the legislative branch, the courts, and the media. And if you weaken all the three, of course you have an issue with your democracy. I won't talk about the U.S. I'll talk about us. We have a very strong legislative branch. We have a very strong judicial system, which people respect. And we need to make sure that we have a strong media sector. And these journalists, I don't always agree with them, okay? They make my life very difficult. But I know that they're asking questions based on the fact that I'm in a position of leadership and power, and I need to be accountable to people. And, you know, you cannot have only social media platforms to have a democracy. You need to be able to have both. And I think also that it's important that social media platforms respect the laws and the regulations of this country, and of also countries that have the well-being of their citizens at stake. And that's why we came up also with an important legislation about online harm and making sure that children are protected. And we have to do more of that. It's not a question of free speech, guys. It is a question of how can we make sure that there's no freedom to intimidate, freedom to be violent, freedom to discriminate. When we came up with the issue of freedom of speech, it was about freedom from discrimination, freedom from violence. That's part of our Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And so we need to be able to keep social cohesion in this country, defend our democracy, defend our sovereignty, and I count on all of you to do that every single day.
Hear, hear. We are over time, but I do want to ask you one final question, and perhaps it is linked to social cohesion. And I would be remiss if I didn't ask you this. This is an incredibly precarious time for our country in so many ways. At the same time, there are comments about needing more leadership at the federal level. So there is a leadership vote coming up on March 9th, and perhaps there will be an election very quickly thereafter. How do you then navigate this time when we're going to be in the middle of a campaign, and how do you continue to really be accountable to Canadians and ensure that you're on the world stage defending our rights?
Well, I think, you know, there's always what we call a caretaker convention where ministers are still in their position while they're basically candidates running in their own ridings. But I'm very much aware, and I said that to my team back in December, I will be doing the work as foreign minister, meanwhile, as still campaigning. Like my colleagues, for example, from Germany that were just through an election did. Because we're facing real threats. And meanwhile, democracy needs to continue. So I'll do both. I'm able to do both. And ultimately, Canadians will take their decision. I'm confident.
Minister Joly, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
That brings an end to our event. Thank you very much for joining us, everyone. Really appreciate you being here on a Friday sunny morning. And thank you again, Minister, and wishing you all the best on the world stage in a very, very challenging time. Thank you. Thank you.